Hello, everybody. Let's get straight to it. We are live and we are taking any questions from any of our followers that would join this live session. If there's a pause and we have no questions, I decided to go through a few topics that I prepared beforehand and just would like to discuss a few areas that may be interesting for young consultants, young business analysts that are just trying to get better and start their career. All right, so let's see, we have 0 so far. So while we're waiting, let me just go and talk about what I think makes a good consultant, a good business analyst, management consultant, whatever you want to call it. Right, so it does involve working with people. And when you work with people, you have to, I believe the first thing is to listen what they say. The tendency for consultants is to start talking right away to establish their knowledge and show their expertise, etc. But I feel that it's really not starting with talking. You have to first listen to what the client is telling you, right? You may just ask a specific question or just generic question to start the conversation, but the first thing you need to do as a consultant is to listen what people are telling you. They can complain about how the system is not working properly, different issues that they're having. They may start talking about their business processes, their day-to-day life, and they may go pretty fast just because they do it every day and they just kind of find it very natural to them. So you have to be able to listen and digest and pick up important pieces of information that then you will later use to ask questions or make some statements, right? So the listening part is what I think is the first thing that you would have to learn to be a good consultant. And some people say that it's easy to do. It's easy to do listening, right? Just kind of, but that in reality is while you're listening, you have to be preparing for the next steps. You have to be kind of deciding what you will ask next once you have a pause in the conversation. In the second part, I think a good consultant have to ask intelligent questions, right? So you just have to be not just, sometimes it's good to ask a generic question. So how do you do purchasing, for example, or how's your sales or picking process, how does it look? But sometimes I think just to show that you really understood what's been explained to you is you have to ask a specific question based on what you just heard, right? And sometimes it takes patience to actually save that question and make sure that you only are asking when there's a pause so you do not interrupt a speaker, right? So you have to kind of make a mental note saying, yes, I would like to ask a question about the statement that I just heard, but I will not ask it right away just because there's no pause and I don't want to interrupt. Right? So asking intelligent questions based on what you've heard, very specific questions, clarification questions is what I think shows more of your expertise versus just start talking about how standard solution, be it in ERP or CRM system, how it actually works. Let me just check if we have any comments so far. All right. Okay, so asking question is what I feel is a good practice for a good consultant, right? And it's sometimes what I think you have to be aware of is you don't want to take over necessarily. Sometimes, especially when doing the analysis, it's really just kind of a free flow, and you still have to have certain borders because you would like to cover certain topics. What many analysts have is a questionnaire that they either distribute beforehand and send it to the clients and basically saying, go through a list of, 50 or 100 questions per functional area, and please give me the answers to those, and I will use those answers to maybe kind of run more targeted discovery sessions, the analysis sessions. But sometimes you have those questions kind of in your head, and even if you did not have those questions prepared beforehand, which is still a good practice, you can just kind of guide discussion using those generic questions, and then once you starting the conversation and the user is telling you about how that specific process is currently done in their company, then that's when you have to pick up what is being said and ask the questions that are very specific. for you as a consultant, which is to be saying that, it's I will do whatever you have right now. I will copy the processes that you have right now with all the steps that currently exist into a new system and replicate them in a new system that we are implementing, or helping you implement. Right, but that's an easy way out, right? First thing is that process might not be efficient, right? That process may exist in the current system, in their current legacy system, just because the system that they are currently using have limitations, right? And that system is not perfect, and the only way for them to work around was just to create a process that might not be as efficient as they would like to have it. Sometimes is that in order to replicate that process in the new system that you are implementing, be it in an ERP system or CRM, you have to go and start creating customizations. And I think you don't want to do it right away. You need to challenge, do we really need to have the process the way it is right now? Or or we can accept the process that actually exists out of box, like a standard feature in the new system, right? And I think the challenge here doesn't have to be personal per se, so you're not specifically targeting an individual that says this is the way things are done. You just have to keep in mind that it's really not personal. You're not attacking anyone. You just want to make sure that we are not wasting any effort copying something that might not necessarily be to the benefit of the entire organization. Right, so challenge status quo is something that some consultants, especially young consultants, are not very comfortable with. But that's something that would help you to become a better consultant, just because, again, when you do this type of questioning and challenging, it doesn't have to come across as a personal attack. It has to come across as, I'm just trying to help you, right? I'm not trying to make your life miserable. I'm just trying to make sure that the system that you will get eventually, right? Because someone is actually, your bosses may ask us to implement that new system, and you will get it either way, right? I would like to make sure that this new system that you're going to get anyway kind of works for you, and it's not kind of making your day more complicated. It makes simple and minimum number of steps, right? So that actually comes after the analysis. Once you gathered all the requirements, document them in a fit gap sheet, and you proceed to the next phase of the implementation project, which is design, right? So when you design processes, I think I would like to keep them simple from the beginning. So I would like to make sure that whatever we are trying to design has as few steps as possible, right? So that's the goal. That's a starting point. I would like to start with a simple process that have 5 steps, for example, from taking a sales order from create a status all the way to invoice. Then, and only then, when there is, okay, how about this? When I'm getting questions about the certain things that already been discussed, yes, but we have to incorporate these steps. We also have to do the credit check. We also have to go and maybe notify the client of the shortages, change of dates, etc. Only then you have to come up with additional steps. But I think a starting point for any good process would be to keep the number of steps to the minimum, and especially those steps that are not necessarily adding value. And that's where you kind of really have to go and use your own prior experience just to better understand how that process can be optimized based on what you saw or heard from other consultants and how it was done in a similar type of industries, right? So keep in mind that the same process, for example, sales order creation by the customer service may look different in different organizations, just because they're in different industries, and those industries have different kind of standards of service that that exist. But also, even the companies within the same industry may have different processes just because of the pure size of the organization, small versus large, or the companies that are just doing the things differently. And sometimes there's always this phrase of, yes, we would like to protect our competitive advantage. So that unique feature, that unique process that we currently have is what makes us competitive. That was made, but you can do much better, or you don't really need that unique feature just because it's not really doing what, it's not really kind of doing what you expect it to do. So you have to be really careful around those discussions to make sure that you understand the importance of that process, and you will try your best to find the equivalent in a new system as much as possible, right? To use the standard functionality. And only as the next measure or the last measure, you would actually go and create a customization. For example, a lot of distributors are very sensitive about how they price things, right? So how the sales price come about, and how what the cost is used to calculate the profit margin, and how because it's all based on the commission, right? So the determining of the sales price, the most optimal sales price, and what cost to use. Is it the current standard cost? Is it a replacement cost? Is it like the actual cost that you is based on what you actually paid for it, on the purchase orders, etc.? Is something that a lot of distributor companies find that to be unique to them, and that's an area that usually you have to listen very carefully, understand what they are saying to you, and come up with a process out of box as much as possible, and only add steps as necessary, right? Because my philosophy here, or in this regard, would be to start with a standard feature that exists, that may do maybe fulfill a partial requirement, and then move on and kind of add components to that standard feature to enhance it, basically to build on top of it, to come up with a complete solution that completes or kind of fulfills the requirements 100%. Another thing, let me just check if we have any questions here. Okay, so no questions so far. Another thing that I'll say is, let me just show this. Another thing that I'll say is, you don't have to, as a good consultant, you don't plan or you don't build around exceptions. What happens is you discuss a certain process. Here's how we usually do things. You come up with a plan, you design the process that has like 5-7 steps, whatever that is, and you're actually doing a demonstration of that process, maybe during the CRP conference room pilot, or maybe during one of those design sessions where you just did some mock-ups, come up with some designs, and actually showing that process that will exist in a new system. And that's when the tendency for users start to pick up on things that happens sometimes, rarely, but that can cause it to break that process. So for example, how about this? When we get a rush order, how do we reschedule and put it in front of the queue? Or sometimes during this we start picking, but we have to go and add an item to it, or like different type of scenario that actually are exceptions that you really have to be aware of, for sure, but you don't really necessarily create a process that will incorporate all those exceptions. Why? Because this way you will come up with a process that has few more steps, and that process will probably might need to be customized because it might not be supported from out of box. Right. So what you need to come up with is maybe for a workaround solution that is not as streamlined, it has more steps, and maybe not as user-friendly, it has more clicks, but at the same time, if that happens, and that happens like once a month or once a year, whatever that exception that is, you can then use it and say, here's a workaround that we come up with that. Yes, it has twice as many steps, but at the same time, because it doesn't happen very often, I think you guys can live with that, right? And if you really don't want to live with that, then you should understand that the only option would be to customize the standard solution that brings its own set of complications and additional efforts that would be involved with that, right? So you have to always present options. I think that's important. And sometimes, you have a preferred way of doing things, but presenting options to users is another thing that you can do as a good consultant, just because this is how I've done in the past. But yes, you can use, for example, different functionalities as an alternative, right? One example that comes to my mind would be using service items on the purchase order, sales order to add charges, for example, for freight, or using a miscellaneous charges functionality that exists in many systems instead, right? So there are different approaches that may achieve similar results, but there is definitely, a good consultant should present those to them, explain the pros and cons of each, and the users will then make an educated decision based on the information that you presented to them. All right. And I think, let me just kind of conclude the whole thing about what makes a good consultant, in my opinion, is the last topic that kind of comes to mind is that you have to be politically correct and politically savvy when you are talking to users, right? Sometimes in large enterprises, large organizations, there is some frictions between departments, right? So customer service, then there is a production department, there's finance, maybe there's some purchasing and procurement somewhere in between, right? So there are some influence centers that exist, and sometimes the politics gets in the a way, right? So one group actually comes to and say, these guys don't understand what they're telling you. We are sales, we understand better, we are more important. This is how we would like you to come to design the system around us. And then the customer service comes and say the same thing about sales, etc. Right? So there are some frictions, adding any controversial information or statements that can be then used against these certain departments in that organization. So you have to kind of be aware of that situation. People complain, yes, usually nod their head. People are saying that other departments are not doing their job properly, they aren't efficient. Again, you're just nodding your head without actually kind of confirming and kind of agreeing with them, or disagreeing with them, right? But just basically trying to stay as neutral as possible. But especially on the long implementation project that lasts like over 6 months, a year, or over a year, that you tend to get entrenched, right? You come to on site almost every week. You talk to those users. You basically become part of their organization. In some certain cases, you have a desk. You kind of come to the office every week, as I said. So it's important for you to still realize that you are just a temporary help on this project that comes and goes, and you don't want to take anyone else's sides. You just want to make sure that discussions are transparent and decisions are made in a proper fashion. Again, it's not your job. It's not really your job as a consultant to make them to come up with a process for the decision makers. It's a job for the project managers on the partner side, project manager on the client side, to come up with a process how those decisions, critical decisions, are made, right? So at the same time, you just kind of what you tend to avoid is what you want to avoid is making decision during a meeting with one department, and then that decision is kind of affecting other departments that were not involved. I think you would want to avoid those situations just to make sure that you don't create any unnecessary friction. All right. All right, guys. So this is more or less a few cents about the business consultants and how to kind of have to be a good one. I think I was planning to run this live session for half an hour, so I think we have around 10 minutes left right now. I see that I don't see any questions that are being asked in the chat, so let me just check that. Yeah, there is nothing. There are no questions. So I would like to take the last 10 minutes, maybe talking about a specific concept, right? So the slide that I had before was basically, I was thinking about the concept of you have to walk before you run, right? So you have to prepare yourself to have enough knowledge of business concepts before you can actually go and be a good consultant implementing any solution, right? In this case, what I will be talking about, and I will try to keep it as generic as possible, right? I'm not talking about any specific ERP systems, even though myself personally and my company, we are working exclusively with the Microsoft Finance and Operation. That's a full official name, right? So what I will be talking about here is not specific to Dynamics, not specific to SAP, not specific to Salesforce or anything like that. Those are just business concepts that I feel would help you to be a good consultant. What I say that is, once you understand those business concepts, that they exist, that the companies are kind of coming up with solutions for these areas, then you will be able to, with the knowledge of the specific solution, you will be able to come up with a good design, right? So as you can see here, those are business concepts that kind of would help you, especially if you're a beginning BA, business analyst, a consultant that is just starting doing things. You know the system, you're probably learning about it, watching videos, etc. But what also would help you is to kind of have the business concepts that are actually behind why that functionality exists in the system that you're currently learning, right? So that's why the whole thing about you have to walk before you run, right? You have to kind of understand the business concepts, and then kind of use these business concepts to configure a specific system, right? To come up with a process that would support processes that are built on these concepts, right? And again, that's all based on my experience. I feel that once you know those business concepts and then you learn the solution, a specific solution in ERP or CRM solution, then it would allow you to be a better consultant and make a better hourly wage or maybe a salary, right? Just because I think it's all about the next steps. You kind of prepare yourself, you know the concepts, you know how project management and accounting works, you know, for example, how advanced warehousing functionality works, and then you apply those business concepts and configure a specific solution, right? So this is kind of where I would like to go in the next live sessions that I will be running. So this is kind of it's not for experienced consultants, as you can see from that slide. It's really just for people that are beginning, right? For people that are experienced consultants, they will not find value in it just because they probably are already aware of those concepts and they implemented them in various scenarios with various different systems in the past. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about, let's talk about a simple purchase order, right? So a purchase order in the system is a document that is used to buy things like inventoried items or service items, right? And I will be talking about the difference between two in the past, in the future sessions, but purchase orders to buy services or goods. Purchase order has different statuses, right? So let's kind of talk about the different typical statuses, like before it kind of comes from the first status to the last status. So the first one is a status that I would call draft. So, right, sometimes companies do not allow you to create a purchase order and send it to the supplier or the vendor right away. Why? Because it needs to be internally reviewed. Why would you do that? Well, to make sure that the purchase order actually makes sense to your managers, right? You're not buying something that is useless. You're not buying something that is costs a lot, for example. They want to make sure the price that you put on that purchase order makes sense, right? It's not high, it's not too low, and it's something that you need to be reviewed, right? So the first step is draft, right? So I'm a purchase agent, I'm fairly new, I've created a purchase order, and let's say that it goes and it's a draft order. That means someone has to go review the items, make sure that those items are needed. Someone has to review the dates that I put on the SPO to make sure that the dates are correct and we're not getting it too late or too early based on other factors that may kind of come into play. And sometimes the pricing have to be confirmed too, right? There's an option, do you include and print purchase price when you send a document to your supplier, to your vendor saying, Mr. Vendor, here's what I would like to buy from you. Some systems would allow you to print the prices, the price that you expect to pay to your vendor based on your negotiations with that vendor. And sometimes the systems would kind of leave it blank and leave it up to a supplier to decide what price he would like to put on it. Sometimes you can get benefit of it, right? Or if they would see at $10 per piece, for example, they say, oh yeah, I would have charged you $8 per piece, but now because I see that you were willing to pay 10, for sure I will charge you 10, right? So there are difference with that. Sometimes that draft state can be optional. So what I mean by that, sometimes it will always go into draft. That means regardless of what the PO, what you're buying on that purchase order, it will always be in draft and it has to be approved, reviewed and approved. Sometimes based on the condition, that order may be automatically approved, right? Let's say the amount is too small, right? So if it's everything below, let's say $500, yeah, it can be automatically approved. No one manager needs to go and review that order. Or for example, that purchase order may have specific items that don't need to be approved, right? You buy in paper, right? Everyone knows that paper needs to be bought. We have a specific price for it. We have a specific vendor, etc. So we can just let it go and approve it right away. So what I'm trying to say is draft mode can be mandatory. That means every PO will go through a draft state first, or it can be optional. The next step is, of course, the approved, right? So there should be some sort of approval workflow in the system. Sometimes it can be just a simple email. I created a purchase order, I printed a piece of paper, and I just went and kind of sent it to my, okay, so we have Mohammed here. So let me just reply. Yes, so let me just kind of finish that conversation here on purchase order status. So once it's approved, you have to have a workflow that actually goes reviews that PO. Sometimes what I'm saying is the approval process can be fairly informal. It can be outside of the system. You print the document, the summary of the PO, you bring it to a table of your manager, he reviews it and say, yes, looks good, change the price here to this one, change that to this one, and it's good to go, right? I put a stamp on it. Sometimes that approval process can be configured and happen in the system, right? So when you click on the submit button, it's actually going to go generate an email or generate some sort of activity for a person. It's going to assign it to the right individual or individuals, and you can kind of move on and kind of the individuals go into the system, review that order in the system without actually getting any printouts, and can make a decision on either accept that order as is or reject it or suggest changes and move on to kind of approving that order or making a decision that order this way, right? So once you approved it internally, the next step is actually the third step of the purchase order is to confirm it with the vendor, right? Because all this so far been internal. The vendor did not see that order yet. You've been working on it internally. You created it and you approved it. The next step is to come up and actually get a confirmation from your vendor, right? And again, it can be happening in a similar fashion as you would get an internal approval. You print out or you generate a PDF and you attach it to an email, or you send a fax to your supplier. Here's what I would like to buy from you. Here are the quantities, here are the prices, here are the dates, here are the terms. Would you be willing to fulfill that order? And you can get a confirmation through an email saying yes, it looks good, or no, change the price, or no, we cannot commit to that date, change it to a later date, etc. Or some systems may have some sort of vendor portals where the vendors can actually log in to review the orders that you submitted to them and actually do that approval process or suggest any changes using this portal versus just email communication, just because it's a bit more formal than using it through an email, right? So that's the third step of the purchase order, which is kind of posting kind of getting it confirmed with your supplier. Now the time comes, so you know that the kind of vendor confirms. So let's say now you need to wait a few days, few weeks, whatever that lead time is for that item to actually get to you. So once you get to that time when the order is actually due to arrive, then it's actually showing up at your door. Let's say you are processing inventoried items, so you're receiving some goods. So the next status is received. What that means is the order has been received in your warehouse, physically received. That means a truck shows up, the driver comes in with some sort of, it's usually a document that is called a packing slip, and say, here's a packing slip, I got something for you, can you just kind of go and sign for it, right? So what happens is the goods being unloaded into your inbound dock in your warehouse. You look at those, and then you have to confirm, make sure that everything that was ordered is received. And that's a matching process that basically allows warehouse personnel on your side to match, okay, I'm receiving that order fully. Am I receiving the items that I bought? Am I receiving some partial quantities? Let's say I ordered 100, but I'm only receiving 70. Are there any of those? So you have to make sure that you're posting a product receipt that actually matches to what you physically have received, right? So you're updating the system, and the orders can be partially received. That means, again, you received partial quantities of what had been ordered, which is a valid scenario because maybe you're going to get a second shipment from that supplier next week, or it can be closed and there's going to be no back order, or it can be fully received where you're going to say, okay, everything that we order actually we got, and I just physically confirm the count of cases, count of pallets, whatever that case is, that you receive those, right? So that's a receiving process, partially received or internally received, right? And there's whole WMS warehousing piece, how these POs are being received and processed using handheld devices, which is a separate topic. I'm just kind of walking you through kind of main stages of the purchase order, right? So once it has been received, now you're basically having some sort of liability. You know that you have to pay for those goods, but you do not pay for them yet. Why? Because you might have not received the invoice from the supplier, because the invoice is that a document that you get from your supplier saying it may come in with a driver right away, it can come in the next day, it can come in next week, it can come in at the end of the month, whatever the case is, whatever the terms are with the supplier. But you're going to get a financial invoice saying here's what we shipped to you and this is what you owed, here's the prices there. So there are a few things happens when you actually go and post that invoice into your system. So many systems support something that is called three-way invoice matching. So what that means is the system compares two things, right? Even though it's three-way, because there are three Why it's three-way? Because there are three different documents it looks at. It looks at the original purchase order, the one that you created in the first step. It has the items, quantities, and dates, and prices, etc. So that's your first document. The second document, it was your product receipt. So that's a document that you generated in your system when you received this goods physically in your warehouse, right? And again, it can be multiple receipts. If you had multiple shipments from that supplier, it can be a single receipt for one PO. In either case, you have receipts, which is the second document, and the third document is invoice. So that's why I think they call them three-way. That's just my guess, right? For people who are watching, you tell me if that's the case or not. So that's kind of three things that it looks at. And how it compares those. It compares two things. It compares the quantity on the product receipt and the quantity on invoice, and make sure they match. So if you received 70, but the vendor sends you an invoice for 100 that you originally ordered, the system should usually flag it and say, hold on a second, we only received 70, right? You have not shipped us 100, but you are trying to give us an invoice that says pay for 100, right? So that's a discrepancy. We have to review that. Maybe there's a second product receipt that we forgot to register in the system, or maybe the vendor made a mistake and they decided that they shipped us 100, but the reality was that we actually received 70. Something happened to those 30, right? So that's one thing it compares. It compares the quantity on the purchase order, on the product receipt, and the quantity on the invoice. And a second thing it compares is the prices, and it compares the prices on the purchase order, that original purchase order that we created, and the prices on the invoice, right? So that's when you can see that, okay, when I created a purchase order, I thought we negotiated a price of $10 per piece, whatever that case, whatever that item is, right? So we thought it's going to be $10 per case, right? Why we thought it was $10? Why? Because maybe we have an agreement, a contract price with you, so we always put $10 on our purchase orders. Or maybe it was negotiated during back and forth over the phone or email, because we don't have any fixed price set yet. So we actually picked up the phone. I'm a purchaser. I confirmed the price. So I put in $10, etc. So you can do that. And then looks at the invoice, and let's say the price on invoice was $12 per piece, so $2 more, right? So that again is a discrepancy. It will be flagged. That will be part of your three-way invoice matching process. But the idea here is once you complete this validation and you posted that invoice, you basically have invoiced your purchase order, and typically that's the last step in your purchase order process. The invoice status is the last one. You can still, some system would still allow you to go and reopen a fully invoiced order and post and kind of add additional items to it. Some systems would definitely allow you to do that. Right, you can configure certain systems to not allow you to do that, so you have to go and jump in and create a new purchase order, because that one is already financially closed, invoiced, etc. But that's basically the idea, right? So that's just kind of one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, right? We kind of spent 35 minutes on this live session. So I see that we have Mohammed. I think we wanted to talk about some issues with we wanted to talk to you about some issues with some product images not showing up on the MPOS in Dynamics 365, if I'm correct. So maybe Mohammed, is if you share some, maybe I will reply to that comment on our YouTube channel, and we're probably going to arrange another session with you. Just maybe you can do it right after this call, because I think it will be easier to do it in this format. But again, it's just kind of trying to help you with the problem that you currently have. This was just kind of an overview for our community, but I still encourage you to come in and join me the next week that I'm planning to run the session, ask your questions, and again, become better consultants. All right, guys, we'll drop off right now. You have a good day.